My name is Lena, to them I am the rejected, not an alpha, not a beta, not even a useful omega in their eyes. I am a silence where a roar should be. I am a girl who watches the tides, not the trophies. My ears are tuned to the wind in the sea caves, not the boasts in the mead hall. They think I am broken, a flaw in the weave of our pack, perhaps I am, but my threads are spun from different things. Where they see a snarl, I see a pattern. Where they hear the wolf's howl as a challenge, I hear it as something else. A story, a lament maybe, a call across the water that no one else pauses long enough to understand. The clamor from the square below reaches its peak. Torin, all corded muscle and fury, has been named the first contender. His roar of triumph is meant to shake the cliffs. It does. It shakes the gulls from the rooftops in a panic of white wings. My little sister, Maya, used to say the gulls were the spirits of lost sailors complaining about the weather. I close my eyes for a second, her voice clearer to me than Torin's. I am an omega, the lowest rung. My duty, as my father never tires of reminding me, is to be silent, to be supportive, to mend the nets and tend the hearth and stay out of the way of true power. My very nature is to yield, but what if yielding isn't always to a person? What if it can be to a truth, to the pull of the moon on the water, to the path of a storm? I look past the square, past the thatched roofs, to where the land claws its way into the sea, the Blackteeth cliffs. And in their shadow, moving with the gathering mist like a piece of the night given form, the great wolf. They call it a beast, a monster, a test. From here it is a smudge of darkness, a living piece of the deep cave where it dwells. Every year the strongest ride out to conquer it. Every year the cliffs are washed a little cleaner of their pride. I have watched it for 3 turns of the seasons, not with a warrior's eye measuring its strength for a fight, but with the patience of the tide. I know when it emerges, not at dawn, but in the lull between the retreating night and the advancing fog. I know its path along the cliff edge follows a seam of bitterroot herbs, ones that flower only under starlight. I've seen it pause at the headland, not to howl but to listen, its great head tilted toward the deepest, darkest tidal cave, as if waiting for an answer from the sea itself. They see only fury. I see a ritual, a loneliness so vast it could swallow the sun. A sharp voice cuts the air below, pulling me back. Lena, stop your moon gazing and get down here. The nets won't mend themselves. My aunt's voice frayed with perpetual annoyance. To her I am not just an omega but a disappointing one, a dreamer, a waste of space. I turn from the cliff edge, the image of the lone wolf burned into my mind. As I descend the narrow path, the raucous energy of the chosen contenders hits me like a wall, the smell of sweat and sharp, fermented drink, the clatter of practiced swords. Torin stands at the center, his arm raised, his story already being written in the admiring glances of the betas. He sees me as one sees a smudge on the wall, his lip curls, not in malice but in pure dismissal. Careful, Lena, he says, his voice booming for the benefit of his audience. The wind up there is tricky, wouldn't want our only omega to blow away, we'd have no one to clean the fish. Laughter ripples around him. Heat rises to my cheeks, the old, familiar shame. My gaze drops to the packed earth, to my worn boots. This is my place, this is where I belong, but as the laughter dies, another sound threads through it, faint, carried on a wayward breeze from the cliffs. It isn't a howl. It's a low, resonant vibration, a sound felt in the bones more than heard by the ears, a deep, solitary note of longing. My head snaps up, my eyes darting back toward the Blackteeth. No one else seems to notice. They are already moving on, the sound buried under their own noise, but I heard it, I felt it. It echoed the hollow space inside my own ribs. That night, as I sit by the hearth minding the broth, my fingers working a tear in a net by feel alone, my father speaks. His words are not for me, but to my uncle about the coming trials. Torin is strong. Perhaps this is the year the beast is finally broken, its spirit added to our pack's strength. We need a true alpha, not just a guardian of stone and sea. The beast, its spirit, broken, the words clang inside me, wrong and harsh, they see breaking as victory. But what if the wolf isn't something to be broken? What if it's something to be met? A reckless, terrifying thought born of that echoed loneliness takes root in my mind. It is not a thought of conquest. It is not a warrior's thought. It is a quiet Omega's thought. A thought of approach, of understanding. What if no one has ever tried to simply listen? The net falls still in my hands, the fire crackles, and I know with a certainty that terrifies me that I will go to the cliffs, not to fight, not to conquer, but to see, to listen, to do what an Omega does best, to yield to the truth of what is there. And that decision feels more dangerous than any warrior's charge. The decision to go felt like a stone settled in my stomach, heavy and inescapable. For 3 days I moved through my duties like a ghost, mending nets, my fingers tracing the rough fibers while my mind traced the path to the wolf's head cave. Sweeping the longhouse floor, my eyes on the rushes but seeing the slick, black rocks at the cave's entrance. The others saw my silence as proper Omega submission, a return to my place after my foolishness on the cliffs. Little did they know, I had to be careful. To go to the cliffs outside of the formal trial was forbidden. It was said to anger the spirit of the place, to curse the contender's chances. But I wasn't a contender, I was nothing. Perhaps my trespass would go unnoticed. I chose the hour of the slack tide when the sea holds its breath. It was a gray, pre-dawn gloom, the world painted in shades of charcoal and ash. The village slept, exhausted from days of boastful preparation. I slipped from my pallet, a worn wool cloak pulled tight around me, and stole into the mist. The path to the Blackteeth was not the warrior's path. They took the open, rocky ridge, declaring their presence. I knew a deer track, hidden by thorny bracken, that wound down to the caves from the landward side. The air grew colder, damper. The crash of waves became a deep, rhythmic shudder in the earth. The smell changed from pine and earth to salt, ozone, and the deep, primal scent of wet stone and things that live in the dark. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a sentry. Every drip from a fern was a warning. I was breaking the oldest law. If I was found, my rejection would be complete. I would be cast out, sent to the high moors to survive alone. The thought chilled me deeper than the mist, but beneath the fear, a current of something else ran, a clarity. For the first time, I was moving toward something I had chosen, not a duty I had been assigned. The further I got from the village, the lighter the stone in my stomach felt, even as the danger grew. I reached the edge of the tree line. Before me lay the scarred landscape of the coast. Great teeth of black rock bit into the foaming sea. And there, halfway down a jagged descent, was the maw of the largest cave, the wolf's head. From this angle you could see why. 2 towering pillars of rock framed the entrance like fangs, and a collapsed slab above formed a heavy, scowling brow. Water surged in and out with a sound like a hungry breath. It was here, I could feel it, a pressure in the air, a watchfulness that had nothing to do with human eyes. I saw no movement, no massive shadow, but I knew. Swallowing a dry lump of fear, I did not descend toward the cave. That was the way of challengers. Instead, I found my perch. A little ledge shielded by a rocky outcrop, overlooking the cave's entrance but far from the main path. It was wet and uncomfortable. It was perfect. I settled in to wait, to watch, to listen. Hours bled into one another. The dawn came, weak and pale, doing little to dispel the gloom. The tide receded, revealing a battlefield of slick boulders and tidal pools. I watched crabs scuttle. I saw a cormorant dive and emerge with silver flashing in its beak. The normal life of the shore continued, utterly unconcerned with legends. Then, as the sun reached its zenith somewhere behind the thick cloud, the feeling changed. The birdsong from the cliffs above ceased. The crabs vanished into crevices. A deep, profound silence fell, broken only by the sigh of the sea. From the absolute blackness of the cave it emerged, my breath caught. No legend, no distant glimpse could prepare me for its presence. It was not just large. It was a force of nature-given shape. Its fur was not simply black, but the black of deep water where no light lives, shot through with subtle threads of silver like moonlight on a midnight wave. Its shoulders were mountains. Its paws, as they settled silently on the rock, were wider than my head. It moved not with the clumsy power of a bear, but with a terrible, liquid grace, each muscle coiling and releasing with lethal precision. But it was its eyes that held me. As it lifted its head to scent the air, its gaze swept across my hiding place. They were not the feral, burning coals of a monster. They were old, ancient and weary, the color of a winter sea under a storm sky, a deep, swirling gray full of secrets and tempests. There was intelligence there, a vast, lonely sentience that saw everything and found it wanting. It did not roar, it did not snarl, it simply stood, a king on a desolate shore, and looked out at the horizon. Then it began its ritual. It moved along a precise path just beyond the reach of the waves, its nose brushing the cliff face. I saw it pause at a specific, unremarkable patch of scraggly greens. Bitterroot, it took a single leaf, crunching it slowly. A medicine, a remembrance. It reached the headland and stood, facing the open ocean, toward a distant, jagged rock spine that was only visible at low tide. It lowered its great head, and it made that sound again, the one I'd felt in the square. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone beneath me, a call, a question, a plea sent into the endless wind. The loneliness in that sound was a physical pain in my chest, it was a mirror of my own. This was no mindless beast guarding a territory. This was a guardian, yes, but one who had forgotten what it guarded, one waiting for a reply that never came. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, the scuff of my boot on wet stone. The moment shattered, the great head snapped around. Those ancient, storm-sea eyes locked directly onto mine. Time stopped. Fear, pure and icy, flooded my veins. I was seen, not as a village girl, but as an intrusion, a disturbance in its sacred solitude. It did not charge, it did not growl, it simply regarded me. Its gaze was a weight pinning me to the rock. I could not move, I could not breathe. I felt peeled open, every secret thought, every foolish hope laid bare before that timeless judgment. Then, with a disdain so profound it was quieter than any roar, it turned away. It dismissed me. To this creature I was less than a threat. I was a gnat, a ripple. It walked back into the darkness of its cave, the shadows swallowing its immense form until only the memory of its eyes remained. I sat there, trembling, for a long time. I had come to observe, to understand, and I had been judged and found insignificant. The humiliation burned, hotter than Torin's mockery, but beneath the burn a spark remained. I had seen its sorrow, I had heard its call. And in its dismissal I found not an end but a beginning. It was not a beast to be conquered by strength, but perhaps it was a heart that could not be touched by fear. Perhaps it required something else entirely. I had nothing to offer but the one thing everyone in my life had dismissed as worthless, my quiet, yielding attention. I would come back, not tomorrow. The memory of its gaze was too fresh, a brand on my soul, but I would come back. And I would keep coming back until I was no longer a ripple but a part of the tide. I carried the vision of the wolf, the guardian. I began to think of it, inside me like a hidden talisman. Its lonely eyes haunted my dreams. Its dismissive turn away fueled a quiet, stubborn fire in me. I had to know more. I went to the archives. Our village's archive was a damp, neglected alcove in the back of the Elder's Lodge, stacked with mildewed scrolls and crumbling leather books. Old Aaron, the keeper, was half-blind and mostly asleep. He waved a gnarled hand at me when I entered, assuming I was there to dust. "Don't mix up the piles, girl," he mumbled. I wasn't there to dust, I was there to dig. Not for tales of great battles with the wolf, which were plentiful. Those were warrior songs, exaggerated with every telling. I looked for older things, fragments, logs from the first settlers, diaries of fisher folk, legends from the time before our pack came to these cliffs. The dust made me sneeze. The ink was faded, but I pieced together whispers, The wolf was not always here. The oldest scraps spoke of the Tidrender, a spirit of the sea and stone that came with the great storm a century ago. It drove a monstrous sea serpent from the coastal caves, saving the fledgling village, and then stayed. It was considered a protector, an ally, but then the stories changed. A proud chieftain, the first to call himself Alpha, tried to bind the Tidrender to his will. He saw it not as an ally but as a weapon, a symbol of his power. He marched into its cave with spear and chain. He never came out. From that day the Tidrender became the cliff beast. It was no longer a guardian but a challenge. A test for alphas, the bond of respect was broken, replaced by a cycle of violence and failure. The village forgot the gratitude, remembered only the fear and the pride. My heart ached as I read. They had tried to master a force of nature, and in doing so had made it an enemy. They offered it challenges when perhaps it craved communion. They saw its strength and wanted to own it, never thinking to ask what it needed. I needed to understand its language. Not words, but the language of its being. I began to map its movements against more than just the tides. I noted the phases of the moon. I tracked the migration of the gray whales that passed the headland. I saw a pattern. It emerged most frequently not at full moon, as monster stories suggested, but at the new moon, the darkest night. It visited 3 specific tidal pools when a certain constellation, the Siren's Net, was clear in the sky. It only made its lonely call toward the jagged rock spine, which the old charts called the last tooth on the solstices. It was keeping a vigil, a ritual of remembrance for something or someone lost. Armed with this fragile understanding, I went back to the cliffs. This time I did not hide on my ledge. I came as a supplicant. At low tide, I gathered a bundle of the bitterroot it favored, along with sprigs of fragrant sea thyme that grew in the sunnier cracks. I took a piece of driftwood, smooth and pale, and placed the offering at the exact spot where the cave's shadow met the light at midday, a boundary place. I did not wait to see if it would take it. I simply left it there, a silent apology for my intrusion, a wordless gesture of recognition. The next day it was gone. Only a few scattered thyme leaves remained. A wild, impossible hope bloomed in my chest. I continued. I never approached the cave. I merely left small, careful gifts. A perfectly round, black stone from the beach, a fresh piece of amber-rich pine sap. I began to clean the debris from the 3 special tidal pools, carefully, quietly, never lingering. I was a ghost in its world, a helpful spirit. I spoke to it only in my mind. I see you, I remember what they forgot. Weeks passed. The day of the summer solstice and the official trial loomed. The village frenzy reached a fever pitch. Torin and the other contenders trained until they dropped. The air thrummed with aggressive anticipation. It felt like a gathering storm, wrong and out of rhythm with the patient vigil I had been witnessing. On the eve of the solstice, I felt a pull I could not resist. I had to go one last time before the violence of the trial desecrated the shore. The night was clear, the new moon a black disk in a sky dusted with stars. The Siren's Net glittered brightly. I went to the headland near the last tooth, but far enough to be safe. I simply sat, listening to the sea, watching the stars. I didn't expect to see it. This was its most sacred time, but I was wrong. I felt its presence before I saw it, a shift in the shadows, a deepening of the silence. It emerged from the cave and moved directly, purposefully, along its path. It did not glance at my offering spot. It came up the cliff path toward the headland, toward me. My blood turned to ice water. This was it. My silent communion was over. I had trespassed too far. It stood on the promontory, a silhouette against the starry sky, even more majestic and terrifying in the full dark. It lifted its head, not toward the last tooth this time, but toward the Siren's Net, and it began its call. The sound was different. Clearer, fuller, layered with a grief so profound it stole the air from my lungs. It was a story of loss, a hymn for a fallen star, a dirge for a drowned world. Tears streamed down my face, cold in the sea wind. I did not sob. I simply wept in silent empathy, my own loneliness answering its own. When the last vibration faded into the night, it lowered its head. And then it turned. Its storm-sea eyes found me in the dark. There was no dismissal now. There was a deep, searching intensity. It looked at me for a long, suspended moment. It saw the tears on my cheeks. It saw the offering bundle I had unconsciously clutched in my hand. Slowly, with a grace that was almost tenderness, it dipped its massive head, a single, slight nod. Then it turned and melted back into the night. I was left alone, shaking, the ghost of its acknowledgement wrapping around me like a cloak. It had seen me, not as a gnat, not as a girl, but as a witness, a keeper of its secret. And I knew with a terrifying certainty what would happen tomorrow at the trial. The contenders would come with force and fury. They would offer battle, and they would be met not just with strength, but with a profound, righteous anger. They would fail. And the village, in its pride, would never understand why. The summer solstice dawned bright and harsh, a cruel mockery of the previous night's sacred dark. The village poured onto the cliffs, a noisy, colorful river of anticipation. They gathered on the high bluffs above the Wolf's Head Cave, a natural amphitheater for the spectacle of failure. I stood at the very back, pressed between two broad-shouldered fishermen, invisible. My heart was a trapped, frantic thing. My palms were slick with sweat. Last night's connection felt like a dream, fragile as sea foam. Today was the reality of blood and pride. The elders, including my father, stood on a rocky platform. The horn of challenge was sounded, a deep, blaring note that echoed off the stone and silenced the crowd. Elder Corwin's voice boomed out, reciting the old, twisted words. "We call upon the cliff beast, we offer our strength. Let the worthy prove their mettle and master the guardian of stone, or let them be cast down. Master the guardian," the words were a lie. They wanted to break it. Torin was first. He looked like a hero carved from oak and bronze. He wore no armor, only a loincloth and ritual markings to prove his courage. He carried a stout spear, its tip blunted with leather, not to kill, but to subdue. He raised it to the roaring crowd, then began his descent to the cave mouth. The crowd held its breath. I held mine, but for a different reason. The great wolf, the tidrender, emerged as the first wave of the incoming tide surged into the cove. It did not slink or snarl. It walked out into the light and stood, waiting. It was a statue of living shadow, its storm-sea eyes fixed not on Torin, but on the horizon, as if the man charging down the slope was beneath its notice. Torin yelled, a raw, aggressive sound meant to intimidate. He brandished his spear. "Face me, beast." The tidrender slowly turned its head. The look in its eyes was not anger, it was weariness, a deep, ancient boredom. As Torin lunged, spear aimed to prod its flank and vault onto its back, the wolf moved. It was not the frantic, savage battle the stories described. It was fluid, economical, and utterly devastating. It sidestepped the lunge with a slight shift of its weight. One massive paw, moving with deceptive speed, hooked the spear and sent it spinning into the sea. Torin stumbled, off balance. The wolf did not attack him. It simply turned its shoulder into him, a motion like a rolling wave. The impact sent Torin flying through the air. He landed in a shallow tidal pool with a crash the wind knocked from him. The entire contest lasted 10 seconds. A collective gasp, then a groan of disappointment rose from the bluff. Torin crawled out, shamed and dripping, his bravado washed away by salt water. The other contenders, emboldened by what they saw as a fluke, tried different tactics. One tried a net. The tidrender simply stood and let the ropes fall over it, then shook once, the movement generating such power that the net disintegrated into frayed threads. Another tried speed, darting in to grab its fur. The wolf's hide rippled and the man was thrown off as if by an electric shock. Each failure was met with the same quiet, dismissive efficiency. No blood was drawn, no savage roars were uttered. It was a master tactician dismissing clumsy children. The crowd's mood soured from excitement to frustration to a sullen, superstitious fear. It's toying with them, someone muttered nearby. It's cursed, no man can ride it. We need a true alpha and none are here. My father's face was like thunder. The village's pride was being publicly dismantled, and with it their sense of order. Then, the last contender, a young, hot-headed beta named Kale, did something stupid. Humiliated and desperate, he picked up a sharp, jagged rock from the beach. If I cannot ride it, I'll mark it. He screamed and hurled the rock with all his strength. It was a dishonorable act against all the rules of the trial. A gasp of shock went up. The rock flew true, aimed at the Tidrender's majestic face. Time seemed to slow. For the first time, I saw true emotion flash in those ancient eyes. Not pain, but a blazing, incredulous betrayal. A final, bitter confirmation of humanity's ingratitude. It moved its head a fraction. The rock grazed its cheek, drawing a single, dark line of liquid that was not quite red, but shimmered like spilled oil under the sun. The Tidrender went utterly still. The air grew heavy, charged with a silent, gathering fury. The sea itself seemed to hush. It turned its gaze from the cowering Kale to the crowd on the bluffs, a slow, sweeping look that felt like a judgment on us all. In that moment, I couldn't breathe. This was the breaking point. The last thread of its ancient patience snapped. And then it did the unthinkable. It looked past the elders, past the warriors, past the entire village. Its storm-sea eyes, burning with wounded pride and profound loneliness, found mine at the back of the crowd. The connection was a lightning strike. It saw my horror at the dishonorable act. It saw my tears from the night before. It saw the one person who had not come to take but to give, to remember. It held my gaze for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. A message passed between us, silent and clear, you see, you know. Then it threw back its head and roared. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was the crash of a tidal wave, the crack of a glacier, the scream of a hurricane. It was a century of grief and betrayal given voice. The very cliffs trembled. People clapped their hands over their ears, crying out in fear. Birds exploded from every crevice in a panicked cloud. With one last, scornful look at the prostrate Kale, the Tidrender turned and stalked back into its cave. The trial was over. More decisively and disastrously than any in living memory. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpers of frightened children and the uneasy shuffle of feet. The crowd began to disperse, muttering, their festive spirit crushed. But I stood frozen, pinned by the weight of that shared gaze. The mark on its cheek, the roar of shattered patience. It had looked at me. Elder Corwin's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp with blame. This failure is an omen. The beast's spirit grows wilder. It rejects our rightful claim. We must reconsider our ways. Perhaps a stronger offering is needed. Perhaps we must treat it as the enemy it has become. His words were poison, feeding the fear. They were planning to escalate, to bring real weapons, to kill the guardian that had once saved them. The stone of resolve in my gut hardened into diamond. They had thrown a rock. They had drawn its lifeblood. They saw only defiance where there was despair. The Tidrender had shown me its truth. And in that final, roaring silence, it had issued a challenge not to the village but to me alone. It was no longer about understanding. It was about answering the call. The days after the failed trial were shrouded in a grim, tense fog. The shame of the contenders had curdled into a new, dangerous narrative. The Tidrender was no longer just a test. It was a rogue guardian, a threat that needed to be managed. I heard the whispers in the longhouse, saw the men gathered around my father and Elder Corwin, their faces hard. A spear with a true point next time. Fire at the cave mouth to drive it out. It drew Kale's blood, then it has declared war. My blood ran cold each time. They were weaving a story that would justify slaughter. They had forgotten the old logs, the savior from the deep. All they remembered was the sting of their own humiliation. I could not let it happen. The silent acknowledgement on the headland, the wounded look in its eyes, they were a trust I now carried. But what could I, Lena the rejected, do? I had no authority, no voice. I had to act, not as a warrior, but as a bridge. The thought was madness. To openly approach the Tidrender after the violence of the trial was to invite death, or worse, to confirm the village's belief that I was a traitor, consorting with the enemy. Yet, the memory of its patient rituals, its sorrowful call, steadied me. It did not want a fighter. Perhaps it would not destroy one who came in peace. I prepared with more care than any contender. I took no weapon. I gathered my offerings, the most potent bitterroot, sea thyme bundled with sweetgrass, and a large, empty bladder shell from a deep-water mollusk, cleaned and dried. I filled the shell with fresh water from the highland spring, water that had never touched the salty shore, a gift from the land to the sea. I chose my time not by the tide, but by the heart. In the deepest hour of the night, when even the village dogs were asleep, the path was treacherous in the dark, every stone a potential betrayer of my presence. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. I relied on memory, my hands brushing familiar rocks, my feet finding the deer track by feel. The sound of the sea grew louder, a constant, booming heartbeat. The smell of the cave, wet stone, salt, and that deep, wild musk greeted me like a physical wall. My courage threatened to dissolve. I stood at the boundary where sand met the perpetual shadow of the fanged entrance. The darkness within was absolute. It was the mouth of the world. I set my offerings down carefully, the herbs, the shell of spring water. Then I did the only thing I could. I sat. Not in a defensive crouch, not in a challenging stance. I sat with my legs folded, my hands open on my knees, my head slightly bowed, a posture of yielding, of waiting. I closed my eyes and tried to still the frantic drum of my heart. I focused on my breathing, making it slow and deep. I listened past the crash of waves to the drip of water within the cave, to the sigh of the wind across its top. I poured every ounce of my intention into the silent dark. I am not them. I remember I bring water from the high place. I come with respect, not a challenge. Minutes stretched like hours. The cold seeped through my clothes. Fear was a live wire under my skin. Every instinct screamed to run. I fought it down, clinging to the image of its weary, intelligent eyes. Then I felt it, not a sound but a change in the pressure of the air, a warmth from the depths of the cave carrying that wild, ocean-deep scent. The darkness in front of me deepened, solidified. I opened my eyes. It stood there just inside the veil of shadow, so close I could see the individual, silvery threads in its black fur, the slow rise and fall of its mighty ribs. The thin mark on its cheek was a dark line. Its storm-sea eyes glowed with their own faint, inner light, studying me, weighing my soul. It looked at the offerings. It looked at my empty hands. It looked at my posture of surrender. I did not move. I barely breathed. This was its choice. Slowly, with infinite caution, it stepped forward. One massive paw settled on the sand, then another. It lowered its head, its breath stirring my hair, warm and smelling of deep earth and salt. It sniffed the offerings. Its nose, wet and black as polished jet, hovered over the shell of spring water. Then it did something astonishing. It lapped the water, once, twice, a quiet, accepting sound. It then nosed the bitterroot, taking a sprig into its mouth. It chewed slowly, watching me. This was the moment. The precipice. I had to speak, not with my voice, which felt too small, but with my will. I lifted my gaze to meet its own. "They are afraid," I whispered, my voice a dry rustle in the vast space. "They have forgotten the old stories. They only see their own pride reflected in your strength. They want to break what they do not understand." It cocked its head, listening. "I remember," I said, stronger now. I read the old words, the Tidrender, the protector from the deep. "You are not a beast to be ridden, you are a guardian waiting to be recognized." At the word Tidrender, a profound shudder went through its great frame. A low, soft rumble emanated from its chest, not a growl, but a sound of resonance, of acknowledgement. Emboldened, I continued, pouring out my heart. "They plan to come with real weapons. They speak of fire and sharp spears. They will kill you if they can, to erase their shame. You must not be here when they come." Its eyes narrowed. The rumble deepened, tinged with warning now. It was not fear for itself, I realized. It was a protective fury. This was its place, its sacred charge. Or, I said, the reckless, fully formed idea leaping to my lips, you must show them something they cannot deny, the truth. It went perfectly still. The intelligence in its gaze was blazing, locking onto mine. It was waiting, asking. My mouth was dry. I gestured weakly toward the open coast, toward the village. The trial, they see it as a test of dominance. They try to master you. What if the test is not for them? What if the test has always been for you, to find one who does not seek to master but to partner, to remember with you? I took a shuddering breath, voicing the terrifying, inevitable conclusion. They will cast me out for coming here. They may try to harm me for speaking this, but if you allowed me, not to ride you as a conqueror, but to stand beside you, to show them a different way, they would have to see. They would have to remember. The silence that followed was immense. The Tidrender stared at me, and I felt its mind working, ancient and vast, weighing centuries of betrayal against one girl's fragile offering of water and memory. Then it stepped closer. It lowered its head until its great brow was level with my own. I could see the storm swirling in its irises. It huffed a warm breath onto my face, and then it nodded, a single, deliberate dip of its majestic head. Agreement. An alliance forged not in blood, but in shared memory and desperate hope. It nudged the empty water shell with its nose, then looked pointedly at me and back into the depths of its cave. An invitation. Trembling, I rose to my feet. On legs that felt like water, I followed the living shadow into the heart of the cliff. The cave was not a mere hollow. It was a cathedral. The sound of the sea was a distant, resonant drum. Light filtered from unseen cracks high above, illuminating swirling vapors and painting the wet walls in shades of blue and gray. The air was cool, heavy with minerals and age, and it was filled with history. As my eyes adjusted, I saw them, not bones or trophies, but markings. Etched into the walls with some forgotten tool or powerful claw were scenes. A great serpentine creature with rows of teeth threatening a cluster of tiny human figures on shore. Then, a majestic wolf form, surrounded by stylized waves, driving the serpent away. Later images showed the wolf and humans standing side by side, fishing, tending what looked like the 3 tidal pools. The final series of etchings told the tragic story, a human figure larger than the others holding a chain toward the wolf. Then, the wolf turning away, head bowed. The humans thereafter were depicted at a distance, throwing spears that fell short. The partnership was broken. I stood before this stone tapestry, tears welling again. You kept the record, I breathed, so someone would remember. The Tidrender stood beside me, its warmth radiating against my side. It made a soft, chuffing sound, gesturing with its nose toward the back of the cave. There, in a nest of dried seaweed and sweetgrass, lay something that made my heart clench, a single, enormous, silvery-furred pelt. Not from a wolf, but from a creature like the Tidrender, though slightly smaller. It was carefully arranged, revered, a mate, a sibling, lost to the sea serpent or to time. This was its vigil. This was the source of the lonely call toward the last tooth. It was guarding a memory, a legacy. I turned to the living guardian. Its storm-sea eyes were soft with grief. I am so sorry, I whispered, the words utterly inadequate. I reached out slowly, giving it every chance to pull away. My fingers brushed the thick, incredibly soft fur on its shoulder. A jolt went through me, not of fear, but of connection. A flood of sense, not words, but impressions, the cold depth of the abyss, the taste of storm air, the crushing weight of solitude. The sharp, acrid tang of human betrayal, and beneath it all a steadfast, unwavering purpose, guard the memory, guard the place. Wait, I snatched my hand back, gasping. The Tidrender looked at me, and I knew it had shared that with me intentionally. It was showing me its heart. Its truth, we had a pact, but the village's fear was a ticking storm. I had to make them see. The idea that had been forming, wild and impossible, now crystallized with terrible clarity. It would be the ultimate taboo. It would either break the cycle forever or it would break me. The next full moon, I said, my voice echoing softly in the cavern. They will be restless, they will be planning, we cannot wait for their attack, we must bring the truth to them, to the village square. The Tidrender's eyes flashed, bringing its sacred, wild presence into the heart of human noise and fire. It was an affront to its every instinct. They will not come here to listen, I pleaded. We must go where they cannot look away. You must let me accompany you, not as your rider, as your herald, to speak the words they have forgotten. It paced, a restless movement that shook the ground. It looked at the etchings, at the lonely pelt, then back at me. The conflict in its gaze was a war of ages. Finally, it stopped. It walked to the cave entrance and looked out at the sliver of dawn light beginning to stain the sky. It gave a short, sharp bark, a sound of decision. It was agreeing. The risk was unimaginable, but the stakes were extinction of its truth and perhaps of the village's soul. I spent the following days in a state of suspended terror. I gathered supplies in secret, a leather strap to help me hold on, not to direct. I ate little, I slept less. I watched the moon wax, a growing, brilliant eye in the night sky. The village's anger was a simmering pot about to boil. Elder Corwin announced a council of blades for the night of the full moon. They would decide the beast's fate. I knew what the decision would be. The night arrived. The moon was a perfect heavy pearl, bathing the world in cold, judgmental light. Bonfires were lit in the square, not for celebration, but for bitter counsel. I could hear the raised, angry voices from my hut. It was time. My hands shook as I fastened the leather strap around my waist, leaving a long loop. A lifeline, not a rein. I wrapped my cloak tight and slipped into the shadows. The Tidrender was waiting at the tree line, a massive, patient shadow. In the moonlight, its fur shimmered with that otherworldly silver. It looked at me, then knelt, lowering its forequarters, an invitation to climb. This was not the violent, scrambling mount of the contenders. This was an act of trust. My throat closed with emotion. I approached, placed a hand on its shoulder, feeling that thrum of powerful life beneath my palm, and pulled myself up, using the strap to settle in the dense fur at the base of its neck. I did not sit astride like a master. I leaned close, my hands burying in its fur, my posture one of embrace, of holding on. I am ready, I whispered. It rose, the world shifted dizzyingly. I was higher than any horse, carried by a living mountain of muscle and will. It did not sprint. It walked with deliberate, earth-shaking steps out of the trees and onto the main coastal path leading to the village. The sight of the great beast with a small, cloaked figure clinging to its back, walking calmly into the heart of human habitation, was so utterly outside of all history, all legend, that it took long moments for anyone to notice. A child pointed, a scream tore the night. The clamor from the square died into a sudden, gaping silence. We emerged into the circle of firelight. The Tidrender stood, a monument of shadow and moonlight, in the center of the village it had once saved. I saw the faces of my people, frozen in masks of terror, shock, and disbelief. I saw my father, his jaw slack. I saw Torin, his hand on his knife, his eyes wide. I saw Elder Corwin, his face pale with superstitious dread. The Tidrender looked at them all, its storm-sea eyes reflecting the leap of the flames. It did not growl, it did not roar, it simply stood, allowing them to see, allowing them to witness the impossible. And then, in that ringing silence, I found my voice. The voice of the rejected Omega. It did not shake, it carried, clear and strong, over the crackle of the fires. People of the cliffs, I called out, you see a beast you fear, but I tell you, you are looking at your forgotten past. You are looking at the Tidrender, the protector who drove the serpent from your cradle, the guardian you betrayed with chains and pride. I pointed a trembling hand toward the cliffs. In its cave is the history you chose to forget, etched in stone. It does not guard a territory from you, it guards a memory for you, a memory of alliance, a promise broken by the first who called himself Alpha, The crowd stirred, a murmur of confusion and rising panic. My father took a step forward, his face dark. Lena. Get down from that creature, you are bewitched, you speak treason. I speak truth, I cried, the words tearing from me. You plan your council of blades, you plan to kill the proof of your own ingratitude, look at it. It has borne my presence not by force but by choice. It drank the water I offered, it has shown me its heart. The test was never for us to master it. The test has always been for us to remember our humanity. The Tidrender, as if to emphasize my words, lifted its head and let out a sound. Not the roaring fury of the trial, but the deep, resonant, sorrowful call I had heard on the headland, the call of remembrance. It echoed through the square, through the very bones of the houses, a sound of ancient, wounded dignity. In its wake a different silence fell, not of fear but of awe, of a door cracking open on a truth too large to immediately deny. Elder Corwin stared, his anger warring with something else, the dawning horror of a man realizing his entire worldview is built on a lie. The Tidrender, he whispered, the old name tasting strange on his tongue. The guardian lowered its head and looked directly at the elder. And then it nodded, a collective gasp swept the crowd. The balance of centuries hung in that moment in the flickering firelight between a girl on a myth and the people who had forgotten it. The alliance was offered, the truth was laid bare, now they had to choose. The silence after the Tidrender's nod was a living thing, thick and fragile. 100 hearts pounded against it. I could see the struggle on every face, a lifetime of fear and legend warring with the evidence before their eyes. A beast of myth standing calmly in their firelight, with the most insignificant among them speaking truths that shook their world. My father was the first to break, his voice a ragged scrape of anger and confusion. This is sorcery, the beast has enchanted her, seize her. Drive the creature back to the cliffs, but his command, once law, faltered in the air. No one moved. The men glanced at their spears leaning against the longhouse, then back at the Tidrender's quiet, watchful eyes. To attack now felt not like bravery, but like sacrilege. Elder Corwin held up a shaking hand. Hold, his eyes, old and clouded, were fixed on the guardian. The girl speaks the old name, a name from my grandfather's tales before it was the cliff beast. He took a hesitant step forward, ignoring my father's hissed warning. You acknowledge this, you are the Tidrender? The great head dipped again, once, deliberate, a murmur this time of awe, not fear, rippled through the crowd. And you, Corwin turned his piercing gaze to me, you claim it showed you its heart, you claim an alliance. I do not claim it, I said, my voice stronger now, carried on a current of certainty. I am living it. It allowed me into its sanctuary. It showed me the etchings on the wall, the story of the serpent and the broken bond. It grieves for what was lost. Not for itself, but for the partnership you abandoned. An old woman, Granny Marin, the village weaver who never spoke in councils, shuffled forward. Her eyes were milky with age, but they saw with a different sight. I remember a story sung to me of the sea-wolf's bargain. It asked for nothing but remembrance and the care of the sacred pools. She pointed a bony finger at the Tidrender. We stopped tending the pools generations ago. We called it superstition. The truth, once uncorked, began to pour out. Other elders nodded, whispering fragments of ballads half remembered. The monolithic myth of the savage beast was cracking, revealing the forgotten history beneath. But my father and the younger warriors, their identities built on conquering this very creature, could not bend so easily. Torin found his voice laced with scorn. So it is a sad old dog now. And we should pity it, forgive it for tossing our best into the sea. This changes nothing. It is still a power that does not bow to us. That is the heart of it. The Tidrender's eyes shifted to Torin. There was no anger in its gaze, only a profound, weary understanding. It knew this mind. It had faced it for 100 years. Then it did something that stole the breath from every one of us. It moved, not with aggression, but with purpose. It walked slowly toward the village's central well, a stone circle built over the deepest freshwater spring. The crowd parted before it like a sea before a ship's prow. I held on, a mere passenger to its will. At the well, it stopped. It looked at the stones, then at the people. It lifted a massive front paw and brought it down, not with a smash, but with a controlled, solid thud on the ground beside the well's rim. Once, twice, a third time. Then it looked at Granny Marin and back at the ground. The old woman's eyes widened. The three pools, the sacred pools on the shore, it mirrors them. The wellspring is the heart of the village, as the pools are the heart of the coast. She hobbled closer, her voice rising with excitement. In the tale, the Tidrender's vigil kept the springs sweet and the seas abundant. When we forgot the pools, did we weaken our own well? A superstitious chill went through the crowd. Our well had run brackish 2 summers past after a particularly contemptuous trial where a contender had defiled the headland with trash. We'd blamed the weather. The Tidrender was not just showing us history, it was showing us consequence. It was speaking in the only language it could, symbol, ritual, echoed meaning. It turned then, its majestic head sweeping over the assembled villagers. Its gaze lingered on the fishermen, on the children, on the elders. Finally, it settled on me. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through its body into mine. A question, have they seen? Is it enough? I knew it was. Seeing was not believing. Belief required a leap they were not ready to make. The warriors still clutched their pride like a lifeline. Elder Corwin sank onto a bench, his face ashen. All these years we have been insulting a benefactor, provoking a guardian. He looked at my father, at Torin. The Council of Blades is dissolved, there will be no attack. A victory, but a fragile temporary one. I saw the resentment hardening in Torin's eyes. Dissolving a council was not the same as forging a new pact. The Tidrender needed to return to its cliffs, and what was I now? A bridge that had served its purpose. Would I be cast out for my defiance or tolerated as a strange, necessary oracle? As if reading the tension, the Tidrender let out a soft chuff. It turned, beginning its slow, deliberate walk back the way we had come. The crowd remained utterly still, watching it go, a procession of one. When we reached the tree line, it stopped. It knelt, allowing me to slide from its back. My legs trembled, weak from adrenaline and emotion. I faced it, this immense, lonely power that had trusted me with its truth. It nudged my shoulder with its nose, a gesture of startling gentleness. Then it looked toward the village and back at me. The message was clear. Your work is there now, the remembering. They are afraid, I whispered, and fear can turn back to anger so quickly. It nodded as if to say it knew this better than anyone. Then it leaned close and for a fleeting second rested its great, heavy forehead against mine, a blessing, a transfer of strength. A silent promise that our connection was not severed. Then it turned and melted into the forest, a shadow returning to shadow. I stood alone in the moonlight, the imprint of its brow still warm on my skin. I had walked into the fire and emerged unburned, but I was no longer Lena the rejected. I was something new and undefined. And the most dangerous part of the journey, changing the hearts of my people, was just beginning. The village did not sleep that night. I could feel the wakeful energy humming through the walls of my family's hut. Whispers, arguments, the clink of cups as people talked through the dawn. I stayed in my corner, pretending to sleep, listening. The reactions were a tangled net. Granny Marin and a few of the oldest were fervent, speaking of old signs and portents finally explained. The fishermen, a practical lot, were deeply unsettled by the connection to the well and the pools. Superstition was a powerful force when it touched survival. The warriors and their families were sullen, defensive. Their entire framework of honor and status had been publicly dismantled. I was left in a strange limbo. No one yelled at me. No one ordered me to mend nets. My father would not even look at me. My aunt moved around me as if I were a ghost, her mouth a tight, disapproving line. I was not punished, but I was utterly isolated. The silence was heavier than any shouting. At midday, Elder Corwin summoned me. The elder's lodge was smoky and tense. Corwin, my father, Torin, and a few other senior hunters were present. Sit, Lena, Corwin said, his voice tired. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, the calm Omega mask back in place, though my heart thrummed. What you did, my father began, his voice low and dangerous, was beyond recklessness. You could have been killed, you could have brought its wrath down on every one of us. It has no wrath, father, I said, meeting his eyes, only grief and a steadfast purpose. I brought no wrath, I brought a mirror, Torin scoffed. A pretty story, but stories don't fill bellies or protect borders. We have real enemies, raiders from the north. A beast, even a sad one, is a distraction. We need strength we can control. Perhaps, Elder Corwin interjected, true strength is not always about control. The girl has done what no warrior in 10 generations has. She has approached the Tidrender and returned not only unharmed, but acknowledged. He studied me. It trusts you. It should, my father snapped. She is an Omega. Her nature is to follow, not to treat with powers. And yet, Corwin said softly, the power treated with her. He leaned forward. Lena, you speak of alliance. Of a partnership reborn. What does that mean, in practical terms? Does it fight for us? Does it grant us favors? What is the bargain? This was the question I had feared. They wanted a transaction. The Tidrender's language was one of symbiosis, of silent, mutual care. How could I translate that into terms they would understand? The bargain, I said slowly, choosing each word, is the one your grandfathers broke. It is not a list of demands. It is a state of being. We care for the sacred places, the 3 tidal pools, the headland. We remember its history and tell it truly. We offer respect, not challenges. In return, the Guardian's vigil continues. The balance it keeps between the deep sea and the shore remains. The well stays sweet. The fish runs remain abundant. Its presence alone wards off greater threats as it did the serpent. Superstition, Torin muttered. Is it? I pressed, a spark of defiance rising. When was the last time a sea serpent ravaged our coast? When was the last time a great storm wiped our village from the cliffs? We have been protected, and we called it luck while spitting on the protector. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping. Enough, this is not a negotiation with a child. Corwin, we cannot base our safety on the whims of a beast and this girl's interpretations. We will increase patrols, we will fortify the palisade, we will rely on our strength. He stormed out. Torin followed, casting a last contemptuous look my way. The other hunters filed out, leaving me alone with Elder Corwin. The old man sighed, rubbing his temples. He is afraid, Lena. You have pulled the foundation from under him, from many of them. I know, I whispered, the weight of it crushing. This trust you speak of, can it be tested? Can it be shown? He asked, his eyes sharp. The people need more than words. They need a sign even the doubters cannot deny. A cold dread trickled down my spine. What kind of sign? The raiders from the Skerries have been probing our northern fishing grounds. Their boats were seen 2 days ago. If they attack, and if the Tidrender were to intervene to protect not just a place but us, he let the thought hang. He wanted the Guardian to fight for us, to become a weapon after all, just one on our side. It was the same old desire, dressed in new clothes. It will not attack humans on our command, I said firmly. That is not its purpose. That would make it no better than the serpent it drove away. Then what is its purpose? Corwin asked, frustration edging his voice. If it will not aid in our defense, what good is an ally? The gulf between our worlds felt unbridgeable. Its purpose is to guard the balance. Perhaps if our village is part of that balance, it will be guarded too. But not as a pet, not as a weapon, as part of the whole. Corwin looked at me for a long time. You ask for a faith that is very hard for practical people to hold. Go, tend to the pools if you must be its voice. But know this, if the raiders come and blood is spilled while the great power of the cliffs does nothing, your alliance will be seen as a worthless fantasy, and you will share in the blame. The ultimatum was clear. I had bought time, not acceptance. The Tidrender and I were on trial, and the test was one I had never asked for. I left the lodge, the beautiful clarity of the night before now soured by politics and fear. I walked not toward home, but toward the cliffs. I needed the clean, harsh truth of the sea. I needed to warn my ally, but as I reached the deer track, I saw something that froze my blood. Footprints, many of them. Heavy boots coming and going from the village, leading down to the shore near the Wolf's Head cave. And beside one print, a single glinting scale, the color of tarnished copper and as large as my thumbnail. A scale that did not belong to any fish in our waters. The raiders hadn't just been probing our fishing grounds, they had already been here, to our sacred shore, and they had been at the Tidrender's cave. The copper scale burned in my palm, a tiny, hard weight of impending disaster. The raiders weren't just coming for fish. They were coming for legend. They had scouted the Tidrender. Did they mean to kill it, to steal some token of its power? Fear for my people twisted in my gut with a sharper, more primal fear for my ally. I abandoned caution and ran down the deer track, the scale clenched in my fist. The familiar path felt alien, tainted by the foreign footprints. I burst onto the shore, my eyes scanning the cave mouth, the headland, the pools. Everything looked normal. The tide was coming in, fingers of foam stretching over the sand. The cave was a dark maw. There was no sign of the Tidrender. "Hello," I called, my voice swallowed by the crash of waves. "It's me, Lena," only the sea answered. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Had they already? From the deep shadow of the cave, a shape detached itself. The Tidrender emerged, but its demeanor was different. Its head was low, its ears pinned back, its movements tense. It paced to me, and I saw a new mark, not a cut, but a smear of dark, gritty ash on its shoulder, and a faint, acrid smell clung to its fur. The smell of foreign smoke and metal. It nudged me urgently, its nose pushing at the hand holding the scale. I opened my palm. It sniffed the copper scale, and a deep, thunderous growl rolled from its chest, a sound of pure, predatory warning. It recognized the scent. It had encountered them. It turned and trotted a few paces toward the north end of the cove, then looked back at me, expectant. It wanted me to follow. We moved quickly, silently, along the base of the cliffs where the rocks were jagged and the going was tough. The Tidrender moved with effortless, liquid grace while I scrambled behind, my breath coming in short gasps. After a quarter mile, it stopped at a narrow, hidden inlet choked with driftwood. The scene was one of violation. A small, crude boat was dragged halfway up the shingle, its hull stained with that same strange, tarry substance. A cold fire pit stood in the center of a circle of churned-up sand, the ashes still holding the alien scent, and scattered around were offerings or perhaps attempts at bait. Rusty iron blades, crude jewelry of twisted copper, a gutted, rotting shark, a ritualistic sacrifice that spoke of a brutal, superstitious people trying to appease or attract a power. They hadn't attacked the Tidrender, they had tried to worship it. Or worse, to bargain with it, to turn it against us. The Tidrender looked at the desecrated site, its storm-sea eyes blazing with contempt. It stepped forward and with a single swipe of its paw shattered the boat's hull into splinters. It scraped sand over the foul fire pit. This was its territory, and it had been polluted. I understood now. The raiders saw the Guardian not as a partner, but as a dark god to be bribed. They were a different kind of threat. They wouldn't challenge it directly, they would try to corrupt the balance it kept. We had to warn the village, but the thought of telling my father and Torin that the raiders were here, at our most sacred site, and that they had tried to treat with the beast, it would confirm every fear. They would see the Tidrender not as a betrayed ally, but as a potential traitor, a demon that could be bought. I looked at the Guardian, despair rising. They will not understand this. They will only see that you met with our enemies. It met my gaze, and the intelligence there was chillingly clear. It knew the fragility of the understanding we had built. It huffed, a sound of decision, and nudged me back toward the main cove. When we reached the Wolf's Head, it did not enter the cave. Instead, it led me to the 3 sacred tidal pools. It waded into the largest, the water rising to its knees. It bent its head and drank deeply. Then it looked at me and gave a short, sharp bark toward the other 2 pools. The message was unmistakable. The alliance must be tangible. Now it was giving me a task, a way to prove the bargain was real before the raiders' presence poisoned everything. We had to renew the ancient rite. We had to tend the pools. I ran back to the village, my mind racing. I went not to the elders or the warriors, but to Granny Marin and the other old ones. I showed them the copper scale, told them of the desecrated inlet, leaving out the attempted bribery for now. I spoke only of the violation. The tidrender showed me, I said, my voice low and urgent in Granny Marin's smoky hut. The pools must be cleansed, the ancient care must be restored. It is the first step of the renewed bargain. Will you help me? Will you remember the ways? The old woman's eyes gleamed with purpose. "Ay, child, I remember. The seaweed must be gathered in a specific weave. The stones must be turned to let the moonlight cleanse them. The bitterroot must be placed at the brim at sunset." She began to rummage in her chest, pulling out dried bundles of herbs I didn't recognize. We must act before the full tide. Tonight, that afternoon, a strange procession wound its way to the cliffs. Not of warriors, but of the eldest women and a few curious children, led by me and Granny Marin. We carried baskets, scythes made of shell, and bundles of herbs. The warriors watched from the palisade, suspicious and silent. At the pools, under the watchful, approving eye of the tidrender standing sentinel on the headland, we worked. We cleared choking, invasive algae. We carefully turned the smooth, egg-shaped stones that lined the bottom. We placed offerings of herbs and sweetgrass. Granny Marin sang a low, warbling song in a tongue so old even she didn't know the words, only the melody passed down through generations. It was humble, quiet work, nothing epic. But as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors, the pools seemed to glow. The water, cleared of debris, reflected the heavens perfectly, becoming 3 mirrors of crimson and gold. The air tasted cleaner, sharper. The tidrender descended from the headland. It walked to each pool, sniffed the offerings, and then, standing in the center of the 3, lifted its head and voiced not the lonely call but a different sound. A clear, ringing tone like a bell cast from sea glass, a sound of approval, of restoration. The children gasped in delight, the old women wept, touching their hearts. In that moment, the alliance was not a story or a desperate hope. It was a sensory truth. It was the smell of cleansing herbs, the sight of renewed beauty, the sound of a guardian's gratitude. We returned to the village as the stars emerged. We were tired, our hands chafed, but a quiet pride hummed among us. The warriors had no mockery. They had seen the tidrender's clear acknowledgement. They had seen a different kind of strength, the strength of care, of memory, of patient partnership. But as I lay in my hut that night, the copper scale hidden under my pallet, I knew the true test was still coming. The raiders had not gotten what they wanted. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't bring offerings, they would bring blades. And they would force the tidrender and all of us to choose a side. The peace born from cleansing the pools lasted 3 days, 3 days where the well water tasted sweeter than anyone could remember. 3 days where the fishermen returned with laden nets, speaking of fish swimming right into them as if guided. 3 days where I was looked upon not with scorn or fear, but with a wary, curious respect. I was the tide speaker now, in some whispers. But the copper scale under my pallet was a sleeping ember waiting to ignite. On the 4th dawn, the ember burst into flame. A watchman's horn blared from the north palisade, 2 short, 1 long. The raiders, not a probe but an attack. Chaos erupted. Men grabbed spears and shields. Women herded children into the longhouse. My father's voice boomed, organizing the defense. Torin was already at the gate, his face a mask of grim exhilaration. This was a fight he understood. I stood frozen in the middle of the square, useless, my heart hammered against my ribs. This was the moment Corwin had spoken of. The test, would the Tidrender intervene? Could it? Should it? I knew, with a certainty that ached, that it would not come to the village to fight. Its domain was the shore, the cliffs, the balance. To drag it into a human squabble over territory would be to repeat the sin of the first Alpha, to try and make it a weapon. But if the raiders broke through, they would sack the village. They would take everything. And then they would go to the cliffs for their prize. I had to get to the shore. I had to warn it. To do something, I didn't know what. I slipped away in the confusion, taking the deer track at a reckless run. The sounds of battle, clashing metal, war cries, screams, grew faint behind me, replaced by the roar of the sea. As I burst onto the cove, I saw him. The Tidrender stood on the headland, facing north toward the noise. Its body was rigid, every muscle coiled. It knew. It turned as I skidded to a halt before it, gasping for breath. "They're attacking the village," I panted. It dipped its head. It knew. "They will come here after," I said, desperation clawing at my throat. "They want you. They tried to bargain. They will try to take you." Its storm-sea eyes held mine, and in them I saw not fear, but a furious, protective resolve. It was not here to hide. It was here to make it stand. On its own terms, on its sacred ground, it nudged me toward the wolf's head cave. A clear command: take shelter. "No," I said, the word leaving me in a rush. "I won't hide. I am part of this. The Alliance is my stand, too." It growled, a warning rumble. "You showed me we are connected to this place." I cried, gesturing to the pools, the cliffs. "The village is part of the place. If it falls, the balance is broken. The raiders are a poison. They don't want balance, they want domination. Just like the first Alpha did, you have to stop them here." I was not asking it to fight for the village. I was asking it to defend the sanctity of its own coast, its own purpose. And in doing so, it would save the people who were, however imperfectly, trying to remember their place within it. The Tidrender stared at me, the conflict raging in its ancient gaze. The principle of non-interference warred with the reality of a corrosive threat. It looked at the pools we had cleansed. It looked toward the village, then north to where the raider ships would surely land if the village fell. A decision crystallized in its eyes. It was not a decision to serve humans. It was a decision to purge a blight from its shores. It threw back its head and let out a roar that dwarfed any I had heard before. It was not a call of sorrow, but a declaration of war, a challenge that shook the very bedrock. In the distance, the sounds of battle seemed to falter for a heartbeat as both sides heard the voice of the cliff itself. Then it moved, not toward the village but along the cliff top, heading north with ground-eating strides, following the high path that overlooked the coastal approach. It was going to cut them off at their source, their boats. I scrambled after it, keeping to the lower path, driven by a terror and a need to witness. When I reached a vantage point, I saw them. 3 long, low raider ships had landed on a rocky beach north of our village. Most of their men were inland, attacking. A skeleton crew guarded the ships. The Tidrender did not charge down the cliff. It stood on the precipice, a colossal silhouette against the morning sky, and roared again. The men on the beach looked up, their faces dissolving into terror. They pointed, screamed, scrambled for their ships. The Guardian began to dislodge boulders with terrifying, precise strikes of its paws. Not a blind avalanche, but a targeted bombardment. Huge stones crashed down, splintering one longship's hull, pinning another against the rocks. It was dismantling their escape, their very presence, with the cold, efficient fury of nature itself. Panic is a contagion. The sound of the roars, the sight of their ships being destroyed, traveled fast to the raiders assaulting the village. Their coordinated attack wavered, then broke. A retreat was sounded. They began to flee back toward the coast, only to find their path blocked by a nightmare made real. The Tidrender had descended. It stood between the fleeing raiders and their ruined ships. It did not advance on them. It simply stood, a wall of fang and fur and impossible power, its storm-sea eyes promising annihilation if they took one step closer toward the sacred cliffs or the village. They were trapped between our rallied warriors at their backs and a primordial guardian before them. They dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees in surrender. From my hiding place, I watched as my father, Torin, and our warriors arrived, their pursuit halted by the unbelievable scene before them. They saw the destroyed ships, they saw the cowering raiders, and they saw the Tidrender standing as a decisive, impassable barrier, having won the battle without shedding a drop of human blood from our side. The Guardian looked at my father, at Torin. It gave a single, low snort as if dismissing the lot of them. Then it turned its gaze, finding me in my hiding spot. It nodded once. The message was clear. The balance is preserved, the blight is removed, the bargain is kept. Then, without a backward glance at the defeated raiders or the stunned villagers, it turned and loped back along the cliff path, returning to the solitude of its headland. Its job was done. The silence it left behind was deafening. Our warriors rounded up the defeated raiders in a daze. My father stared at the retreating form of the Guardian, then his eyes found me. There was no anger now, no defiance, only a humbled, bewildered shock. The Tidrender had not fought for us, it had fought for the sanctity of its coast. But in doing so, it had saved us all, and it had proven beyond any doubt the worth of the alliance I had championed. It was not a weapon, it was a cornerstone. And we, the village, were under its protection, so long as we honored our side of the shore. I walked back to the village, not as a rejected girl, not as a mysterious speaker, but as the one who had been right. The proof was in the shattered longships and the unharmed men. The balance had been tested and it had held. But as I walked, a new and solemn understanding settled on me. The bond was real. The alliance was sealed in stone and sea. And with it came a responsibility heavier than any net or hearth duty. I was the bridge, I was the rememberer, and the work of healing a century of broken trust was only just beginning. The days after the raiders' defeat were a study in quiet revolution. The village moved through its routines, but the air had changed. The sharp tang of fear had been replaced by a hushed, almost reverential awe. The Tidrender was no longer the beast or even just the guardian. It was the protector of the cliffs, a title spoken in the same tone one might use for the sea itself, a force to be respected, not challenged. My father did not speak to me of what happened, but he no longer turned his back when I entered a room. Once I saw him staring at the newly repaired palisade gate, his brow furrowed as if seeing the ghost of the Tidrender standing there. Torin was different too. The arrogant bluster was gone, sanded down into a grim, practical silence. He led the work parties that cleared the wreckage of the raider ships, his men handling the splintered wood with a strange care, as if it were evidence of a divine verdict. Elder Corwin formally dissolved the trial of the cliff beast at the next council. In its place, he instituted the rite of remembrance, to be observed on the solstices. It involved a silent procession to the headland, the placement of an offering of spring water and bitterroot at the cave mouth, and the recitation of the true history, the story of the Tidrender and the serpent. I was to be the keeper of the rite, the speaker of the words. It was an honor, it was also a cage. I had traded the rejection of an omega for the isolation of a priestess. People sought my counsel on dreams about the sea or asked me to bless their new fishing boats. They listened with earnest faces, but their eyes held a distance. I was no longer one of them. I was the bridge to something other, and bridges, while necessary, are not places where people live. The only place I felt like Lena was on the cliffs with him. Our interactions had deepened beyond offerings. Sometimes I would simply sit on the headland and he would lie nearby, a mountain of warmth and silent companionship. We shared no words but a language of presence. He would huff softly when a particular cloud formation pleased him. I would hum the old tunes Granny Marin taught me, and his ears would twitch in time. We were two solitary creatures who had found an echo in each other. One afternoon, as I cleared seaweed from the smallest tidal pool, I found something, a tooth. Not a shark's tooth nor any land creature's. It was long, curved, and serrated, the color of old ivory. It was heavy in my hand, humming with a faint, malignant energy that made my skin prickle. It was a piece of the serpent, the ancient enemy. The Tidrender was at my side in an instant. He did not growl. He went utterly, terrifyingly still, his eyes fixed on the tooth, and in them I saw not memory but recognition, as if the enemy were not dead centuries but sleeping. He nudged my hand with his nose, a clear command to drop it. I let it fall onto the rock. He placed one massive paw over it, and a low, sustained hum vibrated from his chest, a sound of purification. When he lifted his paw, the tooth was cracked into harmless, dull gray fragments. He scraped sand and stone over them, burying the echo of the old threat. But the discovery shook me. If a tooth remained, preserved in the sacred pool, what else lingered? The Tidrender's vigil was not just about memory, it was about containment. The balance was more fragile, more active than I had understood. That night I had a dream, not of the serpent, but of the deep. A vast, dark pressure and a single, enormous eye opening far below, drawn by a signal, a foolish human signal. I woke with a gasp, the taste of salt and deep cold on my tongue. A warning, but from whom? My own mind or something else? The next day, a different kind of trouble arrived. A trade caravan from the inland valleys came to the village. With them was a man named Kalen, a scholar from the distant College of Stars. He was tall, thin, with eyes that missed nothing and a manner both polite and piercing. He had heard rumors, he said, of a seaside wonder and a wolf the size of a longhouse. He came seeking knowledge. Elder Corwin welcomed him warily. I was summoned to share the official history. I sat in the lodge, reciting the story of the Tidrender, watching Kalen's face. He did not react with awe or fear, but with a keen, analytical interest. He took notes on a wax tablet. "A fascinating syncretic legend," he said when I finished. "A guardian spirit merging with local geopsychology. The serpent likely represents a tangible historical threat, perhaps a large predator or a rival tribe mythologized over time. The wolf form is a classic psychopomp, a bridge between the human and natural world." His words were dry, clinical stones dropped into the pool of our hard-won belief. He was dismantling our truth into components, explaining away the mystery. "And you, Lena," he said, turning his sharp gaze on me, "they say you have a unique rapport with this phenomenon. Would you say it is a case of empathetic projection, a young woman, marginalized, finding solace and identity in embodying the village's relationship with a feared natural force?" Anger, hot and bright, flashed through me. He was reducing the profound connection, the shared loneliness, the very real power I had witnessed to a story I told myself. He was turning the Tidrender into a phenomenon and me into a case study. "It is not a projection," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "It is a partnership, one that saved this village." Of course," he said smoothly, not believing a word. "The power of belief is formidable. It can shape perceptions, even realities. Tell me, does the creature respond to specific symbols? Have you tried varying the offerings?" He saw rituals as experiments. He saw faith as a variable to be tested. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this man was more dangerous than Torin with a spear. Torin sought to conquer what he feared. Kalen sought to dissect what he did not understand, and in doing so would destroy its essence. I excused myself, feeling his curious eyes on my back. I went straight to the cliffs, my heart a tangled knot of fury and dread. The Tidrender was waiting, as if he sensed my turmoil. I poured out the story of Kalen, his words, his reductive, ice-cold intellect. The guardian listened, his head cocked. When I finished, he huffed a dismissive sound. Then he walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the churning sea, as if reminding us both of a reality too vast and wild to ever be captured on a wax tablet. But I was not reassured. The scholar's doubt was a new kind of poison. It wouldn't attack the body, but the soul of the alliance. If people started to understand the Tidrender in Kaelin's terms, the fragile faith that had begun to grow would wither. Respect would become curiosity, then disregard. The Tidrender turned back to me. In his Stormsea eyes, I saw a new directive. This was not a threat to be fought with stone or roar. This was a battle for belief. And the battlefield was not the cliff, but the village square, the hearths, the minds of my people. He nudged me gently, then gestured with his muzzle toward the village. His message was clear. Go, be not just a speaker of history, but a living proof of its truth. Your certainty must be your shield. I returned, the weight of this new responsibility settling on my shoulders. Kaelin was in the square, examining the well, making notes about hydrogeomancy and communal mythos. He smiled at me, a thin, polite curve of the lips. The bond you speak of, he said, it must be a great comfort. In my studies, such personalized relationships with numinous concepts are often hallmarks of a deep, poetic sensibility. He was complimenting me while erasing my reality. I looked at him, and for the first time I did not feel like a rejected omega or a mystical priestess. I felt like a guardian. Thank you, I said, my voice calm, echoing a fraction of the Tidrender's unshakable certainty. But it is not a concept, it is my ally, and some truths are too deep for notes, Scholar Kaelin. They can only be known by the heart that stands on the cliff and feels the ancient roar in the stone. I walked away, leaving him silent for the first time, his stylus hovering over his tablet. The battle was joined. Kaelin the scholar was a patient, insidious fog. He did not argue, he inquired. He did not deny, he offered alternative interpretations. He moved among us for a week, a polite, persistent question mark. He measured the cave mouth. He sketched the tidal pools. He collected samples of the bitterroot, murmuring about mild psychoactive properties that could encourage states of receptive trance. He interviewed the fishermen, gently steering their awe into descriptions of unusual currents or known predator behaviors that could be mistaken for a giant wolf. He was assembling a case, brick by logical brick, to wall off the miraculous. My father and the warriors, who had just begun to accept the Tidrender on its own terms, were confused by this new language. Torin listened to Kaelin explain how a shared, traumatic history could create a collective egregore, a thought form of protection, and I saw the flicker in his eyes, the relief. It was easier to believe in a shared dream than a living, demanding god-beast. A dream asked for nothing. I fought with the only weapons I had, unwavering testimony and the quiet, continuing evidence of the alliance. When Kaelin questioned the raiders' defeat, suggesting panic and a rockslide could explain the shattered ships, I took him to the inlet. I showed him the single, deep gouge in a boulder, too precise and vertical to be a falling stone, the mark of a deliberate, powerful strike. An interesting erosion pattern, he mused, tapping the mark. It's a paw print, I said flatly. He merely smiled and made another note. The tension was a wire stretched taut in the village. The people were divided between those who clung to the new, comforting ritual and those who were secretly soothed by Kaelin's rational explanations. My certainty became a lonely rock in a shifting tide. The breaking point came during the first formal rite of remembrance. The entire village gathered at dusk on the headland. I stood before them, the offering shell in my hands, the words of the true history ready on my lips. The Tidrender watched from his promontory, a majestic, silent witness. As I began to speak, Kaelin, standing at the edge of the crowd, cleared his throat. A poignant tradition, he said, his voice carrying in the still air. A beautiful way to codify your community's relationship with the formidable and inspiring landscape. The anthropomorphism of natural forces is a universal human. He didn't get to finish. A low, resonant growl cut through his words, not loud but so deep it vibrated in our chests. It came from the Tidrender. His Stormsea eyes were fixed on Kaelin, and in them was not anger but a profound, impatient dismissal. It was the sound of reality itself telling a theory to be silent. The crowd froze. Kalen's face went pale. His words, so confident, dried up in his throat. He was a man who dealt in ideas, and he was being stared down by an idea made flesh, an idea that growled. In the ringing silence, I raised the shell. "We remember the Tide-Render," I said, my voice clear and strong, amplified by the cliff walls. Not as a story we tell, not as a force we explain, but as a presence we acknowledge. I poured the spring water onto the stone at the cave mouth. "We offer water from the high place, symbol of our shared life." I placed the bitter root. "We offer the herb of cleansing, symbol of our renewed respect." I turned to face the people, my gaze sweeping over them, lingering on my father, on Torin, on Kalen. The bargain is not in the past, it is here, now. Every time we choose to see this coast as a partner, not a prize, every time we choose awe over explanation, every time we listen to the growl in the stone and know it has meaning. I looked at the Tide-Render. He held my gaze, then lifted his head and gave voice to the clear, ringing tone, the sound of approval from the day we cleansed the pools. It washed over the crowd, a tangible, beautiful sound that no theory of collective egregore could ever reproduce. The people bowed their heads not in fear but in acceptance. The wire of tension snapped. Kalen did not take another note. He simply watched, his scholar's certainty finally, utterly cracked against a truth too big for his tablets. After the rite, as people filed back to the village in hushed groups, Kalen approached me. He looked older, humbled. "I apologize," he said, the words seeming foreign in his mouth. "I have studied many legends. I have never been studied by one." "It is not a legend," I said, but gently now. "It is a neighbor. You don't dissect a neighbor. You learn their name and you respect their boundaries." He nodded slowly, looking out at the darkening sea where the Tide-Render's silhouette was just visible. "What is his name?" He asked softly. "He is the Tide-Render," I said. "That is name and purpose enough." Kalen left the next morning. He took his notes, but I sensed they would be rewritten. He had come for a curiosity and been confronted by a mystery, and there is a world of difference between the two. The village settled, but I did not. The dream of the deep, waking eye still haunted me. The serpent's tooth in the pool felt like an omen. And the Tide-Render's vigilance seemed more focused, his patrols of the cliffs more frequent. He would often stare for hours at the horizon line where the sea met the sky, as if watching for a storm that only he could see. One evening, as we sat in companionable silence, he suddenly went rigid. His ears pricked forward, swiveling toward the last tooth, the jagged rock spine far out in the water. The sun was setting, casting the world in blood and gold. There was no sound but the waves. But he heard something. He rose to his feet, a low, anxious rumble in his throat. He looked at me, then at the last tooth, then back at me. His eyes held a warning and a plea. He was waiting for something from the deep. And whatever it was, its time was drawing near. The true purpose of his eternal vigil and the ultimate test of our alliance was about to be revealed. The change in the Tide-Render was subtle but absolute. The peace of our companionship was gone, replaced by a coiled, watchful tension. He paced the headland at all hours, his gaze locked on the last tooth. He no longer lingered for our quiet moments. When I came, he would acknowledge me with a brief touch of his nose, then immediately return his attention to the sea. The deep, resonant call he voiced each night was no longer one of sorrow, but of summons or challenge. The village felt it too. The sea grew restless. The waves crashed with a sharper, more erratic rhythm. The fishermen returned with tales of strange currents that pulled against their oars and fish that seemed agitated, leaping from the water for no reason. The well water, so sweet after the cleansing, developed a faint, metallic aftertaste. Granny Marin came to me, her old hands trembling. "The deep is stirring, child. The old stories say the serpent was not killed, only banished to the black trenches. Its sleep is thin, it dreams of the shore." My dream of the single, opening eye flooded back with terrible clarity. It wasn't just a dream. It was a glimpse. The Tidrender wasn't just guarding a memory, he was guarding a lock, and the key was turning from the other side. I went to him on a day when the sky was the color of bruised iron. It's coming back, isn't it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. The serpent. He turned his great head toward me. In his storm-sea eyes I saw the confirmation and a weariness deeper than any ocean. This was his eternal burden. He was the ward, the barrier. The one being who stood between our world and a ravenous chaos from the abyss. He nudged me toward the cave. This time it was not for shelter, but for revelation. Inside, he led me past the etchings to the very back, to a wall I had always assumed was blank. He placed his paw on a specific, smooth section of rock and pushed. With a grating groan of stone, a section pivoted, revealing a narrow, descending passage. An air, cold and ancient and smelling of deep salt, sighed out. He gestured for me to enter. My heart hammered. This was the innermost secret. I took a torch from a sconce and ducked into the passage. It sloped down sharply, the walls slick with condensation. The sound of the sea was a dull, omnipresent thunder here, vibrating through the rock. The passage opened into a cavern so vast my torchlight could not find its ceiling. And in the center, illuminated by a single, miraculous shaft of phosphorescent light from some unseen fissure far above, was a circle of standing stones. They were not of our making. They were older, covered in spirals and patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. In the center of the circle lay a skeleton, not of a wolf, not of a serpent. It was a hybrid, majestic and terrifying. A creature built like the Tidrender, but larger, with a longer neck and great, wing-like ridges of bone along its spine. One of its forelimbs was curled around a smooth, black orb the size of my head. The Tidrender had followed me in. He stood beside the skeleton, his head bowed. The grief that poured from him was a physical tide in the chamber. This was his loss, his mate. Fallen in the ancient battle, buried here in this secret, sacred tomb. The last tooth was not just a rock, it was her grave marker above this very spot. He knows the black orb. As I stepped closer, I saw it was not stone, but something organic, like a gigantic, petrified egg. And within its depths, something faintly, slowly swirled. Understanding crashed over me. The serpent was not simply an enemy, it was a corruption, a plague. The Tidrender and his mate were its opposites, beings of order, guardians of the boundary between the fertile shallows and the barren deep. When the mate fell, her essence, her power to maintain the balance, was captured and contained in this orb. The Tidrender's vigil was twofold: to guard her rest and to ensure her power. The lock on the deep remained intact, but the lock was weakening, the orb was growing cloudy. The serpent in the deep could feel it. It was stirring, pushing against the thinning barrier, drawn by the fading light of its ancient foe. "He needs your strength," I breathed, looking from the orb to the living guardian. The alliance, it was never just about the village. You needed a connection to the world above the waves. To life, to renew the lock. He nodded, a slow, grave movement. My role was not just as a speaker or a priestess. I was an anchor, my belief, the village's renewed respect, the care of the pools. It was all energy. Faith was the fuel. The raiders, the scholars' doubt, they were cracks in the fuel line. We had repaired some, but the tank was still near empty after a century of neglect. "When?" I asked, dread a cold stone in my stomach. He looked upward, as if sensing the sun beyond miles of rock. Then he held up one paw, extending 3 claws. 3 days. We had 3 days to strengthen the bond, to pour every ounce of sincere belief and commitment into the ancient pattern, or the serpent would rise. And without his mate's full power, the Tidrender would face it alone. The first battle had cost him everything. The second would cost the world. I emerged from the cave into the fading light, the weight of the abyss on my shoulders. I had to rally the village not for a battle of spears, but for a battle of spirit. I had to make them understand that their every thought, their every act of respect toward the cliffs, was now a weapon in a war they couldn't see. I went to the square and rang the alarm bell. Not the horn for raiders, but the deep bronze bell used for solstice and storm warning. The people gathered, faces anxious. I stood before them, no longer just Lena. I was the bridge, and I had to bear the weight of the truth crossing over. Listen to me. I called, my voice ringing with a certainty I borrowed from the stone beneath my feet. The danger is not from across the sea, but from beneath it. The old enemy stirs. The Tidrender has stood guard for a century, but his strength is tied to this land, to us. Our doubt weakens him, our respect strengthens him. I saw their confusion, their fear. My father stepped forward. What nonsense is this now, Lena? What enemy? The serpent, I cried. It was never just a story, its prison is weakening. In 3 days it will test the bars, and we are part of those bars. The right of remembrance is not a tradition, it is a reinforcement. The tidal pools are not just pools, they are wells of power. Every time you look at the cliffs with gratitude instead of fear, you are forging a link in the chain that holds the deep at bay. It was too much, too strange, they shifted uneasily. Torin frowned. You ask us to fight a shadow with feelings. I ask you to believe, I shouted, desperation clawing at me. Believe in what you have seen, believe in the guardian who saved you. Believe that this place and your place in it is sacred and worth protecting with more than just spears. For 3 days pour your hearts into this land, tend the pools, speak the true stories, banish doubt, it is the only weapon we have. Silence, then Granny Marin shuffled to the front. She raised her voice, old and cracked but unwavering. I believe the girl. I feel the deep turning in my bones. Will you let pride make you blind until the waves bring teeth to our doors? Her words from the eldest among them landed with weight. Slowly, one by one, the fishermen nodded. The mothers, thinking of their children, clasped their hands. A resolve, fragile but growing, began to knit together in the square. For 3 days the village lived a prayer. We tended the pools in shifts, singing the old songs. We told the children the story of the Tidrender and his lost mate. We placed offerings not just at the cave, but on windowsills in boats by the well. The air itself began to hum with a focused, collective intention, and on the headland the Tidrender stood, drawing that intention in like breath. His form seemed to grow more solid, his eyes brighter. The bond was thickening, the lock grinding shut. But on the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun died in a smear of ominous green and purple, the sea went dead calm. An unnatural, suffocating silence fell. And from the direction of the last tooth, a single, mournful hydrophone note echoed across the water, a sound of infinite hunger and age-old hatred. The serpent knew its moment had come, and it was calling its challenge. The unnatural calm was a lid on the world, smothering sound and breath. The single, deep note from the sea hung in the air long after it faded, a vibration in the teeth, a hook in the soul. The village's 3 days of prayerful focus crystallized into a single, sharp point, terror. I stood on the headland beside the Tidrender. He was a statue of focused power, every muscle defined under his shimmering pelt. He did not look at me. His entire being was fixed on the last tooth. The storm in his eyes had coalesced into a calm, deadly center. This was the moment he had waited for, grieved for, guarded against for 100 lonely years. From the village path I heard them coming, not with war cries but with a silent, grim determination. My father led them, Torin at his side, and behind them every able-bodied person. They carried no spears this time. They carried torches, drums, and their voices. They had come to fight the only way I had asked them to, with belief. They formed a silent semicircle behind us, a human wall against the darkening sea. Granny Marin began a low, rhythmic chant, one of the oldest in our tongue, a song for anchoring the shore. Others joined in, the sound weaving into the tense air, a frail human thread against the gathering deep. For a long moment, nothing happened. The calm persisted, the green bruise in the sky deepening. Then, the sea around the last tooth began to boil, not with heat but with violent, churning motion. The water darkened from slate gray to an inky, primordial black. A shape began to rise from the foam, a hump of scaled flesh wider than a longship, glistening with a sickly phosphorescence. More of it surfaced, coil upon impossible coil, a living mountain of ancient malice. Its head was a nightmare of ridges and spines, its mouth a cavern lined with rows of teeth like shattered pillars, and its eyes, one was milky, blind from some old wound. The other was a yellow, slit-pupilled orb, vast and intelligent, and it was fixed directly on the Tidrender. The serpent did not roar. It hissed, a sound like a glacier cracking, a sound that promised cold, crushing oblivion. The human chanting faltered, swallowed by a wave of primal fear. The sheer scale of the thing, the reality of the myth, threatened to shatter their newfound faith. The Tidrender took a single step forward. He threw back his head and unleashed a roar that was the answer to a century of silence. It was the crash of continents, the fury of the storm, the defiant cry of the shore itself. It was not a sound of fear, but of ownership. "This is my boundary, you shall not pass," the serpent answered with a shriek that clawed at the mind. It began to move, not with the clumsy thrashing of a giant eel, but with a terrifying, sinuous speed, its mountainous coils propelling it through the water toward the cliff base. The Tidrender did not wait. He launched himself from the headland in a leap that defied his size, a silver-black arc against the green sky. He did not land in the water, but on the serpent's massive back just behind its skull. His claws, like curved swords of black ice, dug deep, finding purchase in the crevices between scales. The battle was joined. It was not a fight as humans understand it. It was two forces of nature clashing. The serpent writhed, trying to dislodge him, its coils smashing against the cliff face, sending avalanches of rock into the sea. The Tidrender held on, relentless, his teeth seeking the junction between spine and skull. But the serpent was immense, and its thick hide was armor. The Tidrender's attacks were fierce, but they were not fatal, and the serpent had its own weapons. A lashing, barbed tail whipped around, catching the guardian across the flank. He snarled in pain but held firm. The serpent's head twisted, jaws gaping, trying to reach him. From the cliff I watched, my heart in my throat. He was holding his own, but he was alone. He was the guardian, but he was also just one. His mate's power was locked in the orb, dimming. The lock was not just physical, it was spiritual. And the serpent was the very essence of the deep's chaos, its power fed by despair and disbelief. I felt it then, a sucking drain, a cold vacuum pulling at the edges of our collective will. The serpent's presence was an anti-prayer, feeding on our fear. The villagers' song had died. They were just watching, paralyzed by the spectacle of their own doom. "He needs your strength," the words from the cave echoed. It wasn't just about belief in him, it was about feeding the pattern. The lock needed power. I turned my back on the epic struggle. I faced my people, their faces were pale, etched with terror. "Look at me," I screamed, my voice raw. "Do not watch the deep, watch the shore, remember why we are here. Sing, sing for the pools, sing for the well, sing for the stones under your feet. This is our ground, give him your voice." I grabbed a drum from a stunned fisherman and began to beat it, not a rhythm of war, but the rhythm of the tide, of the heart, of life persisting. I started to sing Granny Marin's anchoring song again, my voice cracking but loud. For a second, nothing. Then Granny Marin's thin, reedy voice joined mine, then a fisherman's, then a mother's, trembling but fierce. One by one, they pulled their gaze from the monster and looked at me, at each other, at the torches in their hands. They remembered. They were not just spectators, they were part of the shore. The song swelled. It was not confident, it was desperate, defiant. A refusal to be silenced. We poured every memory of sweet water, every safe return from the sea, every sunset on the cliffs into that sound, and on the serpent's back something changed. The Tidrender, locked in his brutal dance, seemed to shimmer. A faint silver light, like reflected starlight on a midnight wave, began to outline his form. He was drawing on it, drawing on us. With a renewed surge of power, he forced the serpent's head down toward a specific, jagged spur of rock at the base of the cliff, a rock that mirrored the shape of the last tooth. The serpent, shrieking in fury, resisted. I understood. He couldn't kill it. He had to rebind it, to pin it to the material representation of its prison, to seal it back into the myth. The rock, I yelled to the people. Focus on the rock, see it holding the deep. We redirected our intention, our song, our collective will toward that black, jagged spur. We imagined it unbreakable. We imagined it rooted to the heart of the world. We imagined it as the tooth that anchored the serpent's chains. The silver light around the tidrender flared. With a final, earth-shaking heave, he slammed the serpent's head against the spur. There was a flash of blinding, white light and a sound that was neither crash nor shriek, but a profound snap, as of a cosmic law reasserting itself. When the light faded, the serpent was gone. Not dead, just absent, the sea calmed, returning to its natural rhythm. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the normal, blessed roar of the waves. On the jagged spur of rock, the tidrender stood alone, panting, blood mingling with seawater on his fur. He was wounded, but he was upright. He turned his head and looked back at us, at the circle of humans with their drums and torches and tear-streaked faces. He threw back his head and voiced not a roar of victory, but the clear, ringing tone of gratitude and completion. The sound washed over us, healing, absolving, sealing. The lock was shut, the balance restored. The alliance had held, not just between a girl and a guardian, but between an entire people and the truth of their world. We had not just witnessed a battle. We had become part of the cliff. The dawn after the binding was the most beautiful I had ever seen. The sky was a clean, washed blue, the sun a gentle gold. The sea sparkled, its menace tucked away back into legend where it belonged. The village was quiet, exhausted, but a profound, settled peace lay over the thatched roofs like a blanket. I went to the cliffs at first light. My body ached with a tiredness that went to the bone, but my spirit felt light, clear. He was there, at the sacred pools. He was drinking, and as he drank, I saw the gashes on his flank were already closing, the silver in his fur gleaming over new, pink skin. His connection to the land was healing him. He sensed me and lifted his head. Water dripped from his muzzle. His storm-sea eyes met mine, and in them I saw an eternity of loneliness, finally, fully at peace. There was no more waiting, no more unanswered call. The vigil had reached its culmination. He walked to me, and as he had on that first night in the square, rested his great forehead against mine. The contact was a flood not of impressions, but of pure, wordless communion, gratitude, recognition, completion. I saw in a flash his long centuries, the weight of his duty, the moment he first sensed a flicker of understanding from a lonely girl on a ledge. I felt his choice to trust, and the rightness of that choice as it unfolded into this saved dawn. When he pulled back, the connection remained, a quiet hum in the back of my mind, a new sense as natural as sight or smell. He then did something unexpected. He turned and walked not to his cave, but up the cliff path toward the village. He looked back at me, an invitation. I followed, my heart full. We entered the village together. People were emerging from their homes, their faces solemn. They saw us, and instead of fear or awe, they simply nodded. They made way. My father stood outside our hut. He looked at the tidrender, then at me. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, a gesture of respect to us both. The tidrender led me to the center of the square, to the well. He placed his paw upon the stone rim as he had before. Then he looked at the people who had gathered. He spoke not with a roar, but with a deep, resonant hum that carried his intention. It was a sound of binding, but also of release. He was not claiming this place. He was acknowledging it as part of the whole he guarded. The well, the village, the people, we were now explicitly woven into the pattern. The protection was mutual, the responsibility shared. Then he turned to me. He nudged me forward toward the well, toward the people. and he began to change. It was not a violent shift, but a seamless unfolding, like a wave taking a new shape. The immense, wolf-like form shimmered, the silver threads in his fur blazing with light. His outlines softened, expanded, rose upward, the powerful legs straightened, the great head reshaped. The fur receded into a silvery sheen that became robes or perhaps light made solid. Where the giant wolf had stood now stood a figure, tall, majestic, radiating an authority that was calm and ancient. His hair was the color of a winter sea, his eyes still the swirling storm gray, but now set in a face of noble, ageless lines. He was clad in garments that seemed made of mist and starlight, and around his brow was a simple circlet that held a single, dark stone, the essence of the orb from the tomb, now dormant and secure. This was his true alpha form. Not an alpha of a pack, but the alpha of this place, the prime, the first guardian. A gasp ran through the crowd, but it was hushed, reverent. This was not a beast becoming a man, it was a spirit revealing its highest aspect. He looked upon his people, for we were his now as much as the cliffs were. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm, solid, real. "Behold," he said, and his voice was the sound of the tide gently filling a cave, low and resonant and full of power. "The bridge has become a cornerstone." Lena, who approached with respect when all others brought force, who listened when all others sought to command, who remembered when all others chose to forget. He turned me to face the village. She did not seek to ride the wolf, she sought to understand the guardian, and in doing so she awoke not a servant but an ally. She reforged the bond that protects you all. His hand lifted from my shoulder, but the weight of his regard remained. "From this day she is the voice of the tide, your link to this land and its ancient laws. Heed her, for her word carries the weight of the cliff and the depth of the sea." He was not claiming me as a mate, this was a claiming of purpose, of role, a sacred investiture. He was placing the stewardship of the human heart of this place into my hands, then he addressed the village directly. "The pact is renewed, my vigil continues. But it is no longer a lonely one. Tend the land, keep the rights, honor the balance, and you will thrive under the protection of the shore as part of it, not as its masters." He looked up at the sun, now clear in the sky. "My physical form will return to the deep places, to the long watch, but I am present in every stone, every wave, every root of bitterroot, and in her voice." He gave me one last, deep look, a look that held all the history and the future between us. A look of absolute trust, then the majestic figure shimmered again, dissolving into a swirl of silver mist and sea light. The mist flowed toward the cliffs, fading into the morning air, becoming one with the spray rising from the crashing waves below. He was gone, and yet he wasn't. I could feel him in the stone under my feet, in the salt on the wind, in the new, unshakable certainty in my own heart. The village was silent for a long moment, then Elder Corwin stepped forward. He did not speak to me as an elder to a child. He bowed his head as my father had. "Voice of the tide," he said, the title fitting naturally on his tongue. "The council awaits your guidance." I looked at their faces, my father, Torin, Granny Marin, the fishermen, the children. They were not looking at a rejected Omega or a strange priestess. They were looking at the living proof of their own salvation, at the anchor of their new world. I took a deep breath, tasting the clean, salty air of the morning after everything. The story of the beast and the Omega was over. The story of the voice and her people had just begun.